She was taken, torn from her homeland. No name, no rights, no future. Just another girl, chained to a destiny she never asked for. But what the world didn't know was that this girl would become the most powerful woman in an empire ruled by men. Her name was Hurrem. They called her a witch, a manipulator, a poison behind the throne. But that's not the whole story, because what history often forgets is the cost of rising when the world wants you on your knees. Hurrem Sultan didn't just survive the Ottoman court, she owned it. And centuries later, in a world still full of glass ceilings and silent battles, millions of women still looked to her, not because she was flawless, but because she was fearless. So tonight, we're going to dive into her world, the betrayal, the ambition, the love, and the blood. And by the end of this story, you may just understand why a girl who started as a slave still lives as a queen in the hearts of modern women. They say fate is cruel, but for one girl, fate was a battlefield. She was born in the cold hills of Ruthenia, what we now call Ukraine. No crown, no palace, just a village girl, bright-eyed, laughing, unaware that her world was about to be burned to ash. One morning, men came, raiders, steel in their hands, fire in their eyes. They killed, they burned, and they took her. Her name was Alexandra, but to her captors, she was just cargo. One more girl chained and dragged across continents, her cries fading behind her. She was thrown into the brutal world of the Ottoman slave trade. Stripped of her name, her faith, her freedom, they shaved her head, painted her face, and sent her into the Sultan's harem, a gilded prison filled with hundreds of women, all vying for the same thing, to be seen. But where most faded into silence, she didn't. She studied. She adapted. She smiled when others wept. And when the great Sultan Suleiman, ruler of the world's most powerful empire, looked at her, she looked back, not with fear, but with fire. Her wit was razor-sharp, her laughter addictive, and her letters to the Sultan, poetry that could bend steel. Within months, she became his favorite. Within years, she became his obsession. And that's when the real war began. You see, no concubine had ever dared dream of marriage. The rules were clear. Sultans did not wed their slaves. Women in the harem gave birth, then disappeared into silence. But not her. She changed the game. And the man who ruled the empire broke every law to make her his queen. He freed her, married her, gave her a new name, Hurrem, the joyful one. But the palace was not joyful. Whispers turned to knives. The other women, furious. The court, outraged. Even his own mother, turned cold. To them, Hurrem was not a wife. She was an infection, a foreign girl who had bewitched their king, corrupted the empire, and dared to rise. But she didn't stop. She bore Suleiman 5 children, an unthinkable act that shattered centuries of tradition. She advised him on foreign policy. She built schools, mosques, and soup kitchens in her name. And the rules? She didn't just break them. She rewrote them. This was no longer a story about a powerless girl. This was a woman who had entered the empire's iron cage and bent the bars to fit her shape. But make no mistake, this rise came with a cost. Jealous rivals plotted in shadows. Assassins whispered in corners. And the bodies that fell along her path weren't always strangers. Hurrem Sultan didn't ask to be a queen. She took it, and in doing so, she became one of the most powerful and most hated women in Ottoman history. But even now, centuries later, modern women still look to her story, not as a fairy tale, but as a warning. A woman in a man's world has 2 choices: obey the rules, or become the storm. And Hurrem, she was the storm, the mind behind the power. With your core message, she turned influence into legacy. Power is easy to see, but real power, the kind you never see coming, lives in silence, in letters, in glances, in moves made 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And Hurrem was always ahead. Many called her beautiful, but that wasn't her weapon. Her mind was. While others in the harem fought with envy and poison, Hurrem picked up a pen. She wrote, not poems of longing, but letters of strategy. To kings, to ambassadors, to Suleiman himself. And these weren't just love notes. They were influence wrapped in velvet. In her letters, she advised the Sultan on matters of war, diplomacy, and empire. She analyzed enemy intentions, suggested alliances, and questioned betrayals before they even unfolded. But she didn't just think like a queen. She thought like an empire. One letter, sent to the King of Poland, warned of rebels before they crossed the border. Another redirected a caravan of gold into a hospital she had funded herself. Yes, Hurrem built hospitals, and schools, and public baths for women, a revolutionary act in a time where most women were silenced or invisible. Behind the curtain of palace life, she was laying bricks, not just for buildings, but for legacy. The poor knew her name. The sick called her protector. And everywhere her influence reached, it left behind more than whispers. It left structures. Concrete. Real. Permanent. But what terrified her enemies most was not just what she built, but what she understood. Hurrem saw how the empire worked, and more importantly, how it could break. She knew that Suleiman's power, vast as it was, could be shaped, softened, guided, and he led her, not out of weakness, but because in her, he found something even his generals couldn't give him: clarity. There were nights when the Sultan sat in silence for hours, while she spoke, about politics, about fate, about the cracks forming in the world he ruled. She was not just his lover, she was his mirror, and sometimes his conscience. But not everyone saw this as noble. To many, she was a shadow queen, a woman who moved armies without ever lifting a sword, a foreigner who spoke like a sultan. Some whispered that she had cast a spell, that no woman could think like this, no slave could rise like this, unless she had made a deal with something darker. But the truth is simpler and far more dangerous. She didn't need magic, just intelligence, and that scared them more than any curse ever could. Hurrem's real power was not in her beauty, nor in her title. It was in her understanding of people, of timing, of perception. She knew when to push, when to wait, and when to smile while her enemies destroyed themselves. She turned love into leverage, influence into infrastructure, and strategy into survival. And by doing so, she didn't just outlive her rivals, she outwitted history, because long after her voice fell silent, the world she helped shape still spoke her name. And that's the thing about power no one tells you. It isn't what you hold, it's what you leave behind. She was a contradiction. To some, she was a brilliant strategist, a woman who broke every chain thrown at her. To others, she was poison in silk, a manipulator who destroyed from within. But the truth is always more complicated. Hurrem Sultan wasn't just one thing. She was many. A mother, a queen, a survivor, but also a rival, a force, and to some a threat. She lived in a world that demanded silence from women, and yet her voice echoed through palaces. She rose in an empire built by men, and still carved her name into stone. But with every move forward, there was a cost, because the higher she climbed, the more they questioned how she got there. They didn't accuse her of brilliance. They accused her of witchcraft. They didn't praise her letters. They whispered about spells. Power, when worn by a man, is called destiny. But when worn by a woman, it becomes suspicion. And Hurrem felt that every day. When she smiled, they called her cunning. When she grieved, they said it was performance. Even her love for her children was twisted into strategy. They said she used them, that she positioned them like pawns, preparing her sons to take the throne, while others fell. But what choice did she have? This was the Ottoman court, a place where survival meant sacrifice, and even innocence could get you killed. So yes, Hurrem protected her children, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with cruelty, because to her, losing wasn't an option. And that's where the story turns human, because behind the legend, behind the accusations, there was still a woman who loved, a woman who lost, a woman who feared the very system she now ruled from within. She wrote letters, yes, but she also wrote prayers. She built alliances and buried friends. She knew that power never came free, and in her quietest moments, She may have wondered, was it worth it? But if she did, she never let the world see it. And that's what makes Hurrem real. She was not perfect. She was not pure. She was not a fairy tale. She was human. And that's why modern women still see themselves in her. Not because she rose without struggle, but because she rose through it. Because even today, when a woman speaks too boldly, she's called loud. When she leads too strongly, she's called controlling. When she dares to dream too big, she becomes a warning. Hurrem lived that reality 500 years ago, and still she didn't flinch. So call her what you want: manipulator, visionary, tyrant, queen, because in the end, she was all of them, and that is what terrified them most. 5 centuries after she died, Hurrem Sultan came back to life, not through magic, not through monuments, but through a television screen. In magnificent century, millions watched her rise from slave to queen. But what they saw was more than history. They saw themselves. Because Hurrem wasn't just a character. She was a mirror for every woman who's ever been told to stay quiet, to know her place, to smile more. She didn't. Hurrem never apologized for being smart, or strategic, or emotional. She loved fiercely. She protected ruthlessly. And she refused to shrink, even when the entire empire wanted her gone. That kind of woman still makes people uncomfortable. And that's exactly why modern women admire her. Not for being flawless, but for surviving a world that wasn't made for her. And not just surviving, but winning. They see her in boardrooms, in protests, in single mothers, entrepreneurs, students who won't take no for an answer. Because Hurrem's story isn't about crowns or palaces. It's about fighting to be heard. It's about rising from pain. Not with vengeance, but with vision. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask to be accepted. She took up space and forced the world to see her. That's why Hurrem Sultan still matters. Not as a queen, but as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, a woman with a voice can still shake an empire. Every era has its Hurrem, a woman the world didn't see coming, underestimated, criticized, feared, and yet unstoppable. Hurrem Sultan's story didn't end in the palace. It didn't die with her final breath, because women like her don't vanish. They echo in every woman who's ever been told she's too much, too loud, too ambitious, too emotional, too dangerous. She lives in the woman who dares to lead, even when they say she shouldn't. She lives in the single mother who builds a life from ruins, in the girl who stands her ground in a room full of men, in the quiet strategist who smiles and keeps moving. Because Hurrem wasn't perfect. She was real, and that's why she matters. She reminds us that survival is not always silent, that power doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it whispers through locked doors, moves behind curtains, and changes the world without asking permission. Hurrem didn't just rewrite her own story. She rewrote ours. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her. In boardrooms, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in protests. In every moment a woman chooses courage over comfort. Her enemies called her dangerous. And they were right, because she was proof that one woman with vision, with voice, with fire, can shake an empire to its core. So maybe that's why, centuries later, we're still talking about her. Not because she wore a crown, but because she earned it. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been called too much, if you've ever dared to rise in a world that wanted you small, then you already carry a piece of her. You are someone's Hurrem, or maybe you are your own. So, if this story spoke to something in you, if it reminded you of your worth, your power, your fire, then don't let it end here. Share it, because the world still needs to hear it. Not just in palaces, but in kitchens, in classrooms, in hearts. Because somewhere out there, a girl is still being told she'll never matter. Let her hear Hurrem's story, and let her know she does.